Hi everyone and welcome to my session, Be a Portal Rebel and Break the Mould. Spotify clone with Power Apps Portals, Dataverse and Power Automate. I'm excited to be here. I'm a new speaker, so do please be gentle with me. Before we begin, let's give thanks to our sponsors. Without them, sessions like this just aren't possible. Script Runner, the #1 for PowerShell management. DQ Global, driving data quality. Proximo 3, Microsoft Consulting Specialists, Red Spire, Agilysys and Hitachi Solutions. Thanks guys. Thanks for joining my session. I'm Franco Musso. I'm a functional consultant, citizen developer. I love everything Power Platform pretty much. Started with Dynamics 365, Dynamics CRM back in the day. I'm specialised recently in portals, first Dynamics CRM portals and later Power Apps portals. I'm skilled in the rest of the Power Platform essentially and use that day in, day out to bring business benefit to customers. I'm a lover of music as well as daughters. I would go to a lot of music festivals together, and that's how this passion project came around really, my Spotify clone. So I'm trying to teach my daughter to do some Saturday work with me. The idea was to teach her model-driven apps first, get an understanding of data models, views, forms, all that good stuff, and just wasn't getting any traction, wasn't making any connection. And the first thing she did every time she was distracted was play around with her mobile phone. So I thought perhaps to make this relatable to her generation, I perhaps unpick some of the apps that she was using. So we started with a mail app and got across the idea that we've got, in that case, an email message, various different views and statuses that drive that whole thing, some actions which might be likened to workflow, and that seemed to land a little bit better. But again, we hit that point where she was distracted. So the things her go-to all day and all night was Spotify. So I figured, let's model Spotify. So it began as a model-driven app. We built things like tracks, albums, artists, so how we'd relate those things together. We built the like functionality. And with the day job, as I said, I specialize in portals. So I figured, let's make this a portal project. It'll let us break the mold. It will let us push things further than what I can with my day job. Tend to be very sterile environments. I work in the finance industry, and highly regulated environments don't get the biggest chance to go beyond MVP as far as styling is concerned. So I thought this Spotify clone could be the way to do that. So I'll give you a demo of the portal in just a moment, but essentially that's how it came about. It was a byproduct. It's always been about learning. So it started off teaching my daughter with the model-driven app. Since then, I've learned loads of things along the way. I've written blog posts about the journey, and I've trained staff up in portals using that as a tool. And just about every challenge I've come across on a portal since, I've been able to refer back to that Spotify learning example and either use that to teach somebody else or remind myself essentially how I achieved a certain thing. So I've been back, commented on my code very heavily. So I quite intentionally made sure there was at least one unique challenge or feature per page, so not wasting time repeating myself from one template to the next. Okay, let's fire up the portal. So to start with, we've got a dashboard. So the first challenge, I'd never really tackled this before this project, was dealing with images. So behind this, we've got Dataverse. And first challenge, how the heck do we get images from Dataverse, from the notes entity onto the portal? So that'll be one of the snippets we cover in today's course. So we've used that same snippet. The idea with my learning, I'm not much of a coder. So what I do try and do is get the maximum benefit out of any piece of code. So I tend to Google that. Hopefully this sounds familiar. Google it, find a snippet that'll help you, pick it apart, adapt it to your needs. But then I like to take it the extra mile, see how far it can be pushed, how far it can be stretched, where else I can make use of that. And then I'll add it to an expanding snippet library that I've got going in Visual Studio Code. So what we'll cover today, you'll see for all of this Spotify clone, essentially used 6 snippets over and over again. hopefully to good effect. It's the images. As we've seen, we can navigate to, in this example, these playlists that I've liked, artists that I've liked, and albums that I've liked. So I can jump into any of those, choose to view that playlist. In fact, okay, so I'm viewing an artist in this case. And this is where we've got the next snippet coming into things. I'm now looping through records. So I'm using FetchXML, which essentially let me bring my advanced find skills from model-driven apps and dynamics and make use of those on the portal. So essentially any queries that I'm doing through the portal is using FetchXML, which I've generated with an advanced find. So in this example, I've taken the GUID from the URL, the unique identifier of that artist, queried an image with a specific name. So that again is from Dataverse, and then looking through a load of related records, looking for tracks that are related to this particular artist. So unique challenges on that page were to incorporate the like functionality. So I've got that hooked in with the Power Apps Portal API. I can click that to like the track. Once the users like a track, it'll compare to make sure that they can't like it again. So with another advanced find, it's comparing that too. And also on this, pet peeve of mine is when you visit a website and it's extremely slow because the images are far bigger than what's needed on screen. So what I've done with this is incorporated Power Automate so that when we upload an image through the portal, it'll keep the high-res version, but for little thumbnail versions like this, it'll run a flow which fires off to Encoding's API and brings back an 80 pixel by 80 pixel rendition of that image. On the albums page, utilizing some of the same skills, so retrieving images, looping through records, but this time I wanted to see if I could make use of another liquid function, so I use random for this, and the idea being that every time that page is refreshed, it'll come back with a different album image. So one of my liked albums, take that artwork, blow it up and display it in the background. Similar to what we saw before, I can click through to one of those, view the tracks that make that up. And in this example, I'm using one of the snippets, one of the skills that we'll learn today, to loop through these records. So this is retrieving all of the album tracks related to this album, looping through, populating this with the artwork and with the track, so we can actually play these through the audio player. And again, a common theme, I've started off with a HTML snippet and I've made it dynamic using Liquid. So starting point is FetchXML that I've created with an advanced find, and then I'm looping through that output with another of today's skills, a for loop, to get that populated. So instead of, for example, 3 hard-coded tracks, it's got any number of tracks and it's populated those with the results of our advanced find. So everything we've seen so far, I'm in complete control of the structure, which is my next point. One of my guilty pleasures at the moment through lockdown has been interior design challenge. I'd like you to just imagine if we've got 2 teams competing against each other, which is a common thread on the show. We've got to redesign a workspace for the best possible working environment. But let's imagine one team is just allowed to redecorate, hang pictures, paint the walls, whereas the other team can knock down walls, remodel, change the layout entirely for the best possible result. That's how it goes with the portals. So my experience started trying to style the portals essentially just by uploading a logo and changing some CSS. So the real challenge was, without being able to change that underlying structure, really you're working with your hands tied behind your back. So to get to that level of control, what we need to do is use Liquid and create our own custom web templates. So that allows us to put the elements that we need in any order, any piece of HTML, JavaScript, CSS is fair game, and the flexibility for that comes with Liquid. And said we're going to cover 6 skills. Here they are. So we've got entities. First of all, the entities object lets us retrieve a single record just by passing a GUID. So with one line of code, we've got a full record. So I could, for example, say, pass me a track that matches this particular GUID. So if you're not familiar with the makeup of the URL on the portal, they tend to end in $ID equals, and then we have a GUID. So what we'll be saying in that Liquid snippet is take this GUID, bring me back the full record. So in this example, it's an album, and I can then store that album in a variable and just access its properties. So I can say, fill this image with the GUID of that particular note record. Or for example, here I brought back the title, the number of tracks, stored the GUID on this like button. So if I click the like button, it knows which track I'm liking. That'll go behind the scenes, create a like record within Dataverse. Then we'll look at fetch single. So we're using FetchXML to retrieve a single record. So with entities, we always require a GUID. This is covering scenarios where we don't know the exact record we want to retrieve. So let's say our criteria is something like, bring me the most popular track of today, bring me the track with the most likes, bring me the most recently uploaded track, get me an album for a specific artist. So the idea is we're passing other criteria like we might use in advanced find, other than knowing that exact records GUID already. And that's as simple as doing an advanced find in Dataverse, copying that into your web template, and we'll just change around some parameters. Next, we've got fetch for multiple records. So that's what we've done for things like showing me all my liked playlist on the dashboard, all my liked albums on the dashboard, all my liked artists. So we'll do the FetchXML query, and really that'll be combined with this next skill for, and the idea is that allows us to loop through those results. So we've got a number of results come back from advanced find. What do we want to do with those? What happens with the output? For example, for each of those on the playlist, we saw that we output the thumbnail, the title, and the duration of that song, as well as populating the audio. So all of that would go within our for loop. And for loop, if the language is familiar from other technologies you might have used, that's like a repeating region. Next, the note, really that's where all of our multimedia comes from. So there's a specific URL format which we saw just a moment ago that we used for that album as an example. And essentially all that we need is that format _entity/annotation, which is the logical name for a note behind the scenes, and the GUID. So I'm storing that GUID on a record within Dataverse, and that's how we can output a note. You can use that again for all kinds of things across the portal. You could have that for a download link. So let's say you had a PDF that you want to make available through the portal. You can use that exact same format. I've used it, as I say, for the audio, for the images, and perhaps useful to know how we're getting it to show up in those particular spots on the portal is the boring part of this, but makes it all work, is having a naming convention. So the portal, the way I've implemented it, relies on the fact that I have a note that is specifically called artwork and a note specifically called banner high resolution. So that knows when I'm going and visiting a specific artist's page, that's a high-res image to show in the background, whereas the artwork is what to show on the thumbnail. Likewise, when we come to a track, I'd have a couple of notes, specific names again. So artwork for the cover art essentially, and audio to upload the track that would be playable through the portal. So we can see how that is uploaded. I'm logged in as record label staff. So as well as the permissions that listeners would have, I can come in and upload new tracks. And this will give us a chance to see how we provide some visual feedback through the portal, and also how Power Automate handles that to create our low res thumbnail. So we're now on a web form that I've tried to style up quite a bit. So multi-step web form. We create the track first of all, and then using the Portal Web API to populate those specific notes. So uploading artwork, uploading audio, and what the Portal Web API is going to allow us to do that just the standard image upload wouldn't allow us to is make those specific notes with a specific file name. So I know from a file checking point of view that these have been uploaded, that it's possible to publish that track, but also that it'll automatically feed the audio player. So we've got some artwork, got a track. Submit that. So they then live in Dataverse. We set it in my model-driven app. So I was careful from a licensing point of view to do everything only with model-driven apps rather than require any Dynamics licenses or entities, just from a cost point of view. So we've got our newly created track with artwork, with music. So there's the audio, there's the artwork, and Power Automate behind the scenes has gone and created me a low res version of that artwork. So that happened quite quickly, which is nice to see. So I've got my high res version and my 80 pixel version that'll just be nice and quick to load through the portal. I like to work within Visual Studio Code for my Liquid. The reason being that it's really easy to manage my snippets that I've mentioned. So within my user snippets, I've got one that's all about Liquid, and this I've picked up over various projects. Like I said, I put that extra investment in. Once I've conquered something the once, I'll pick it apart, try and make it reusable, so that the next time I come across project, there tends to only be so many ways of skinning a cat as far as the portal's concerned. So it's a retrieve multiple, it's a retrieve single, it's looking for GUID, it's checking for if a certain variable is populated, those kind of things. So we've got tens of those, which I'm going to share through my blog at the end of the session. But let's say, for example, I'm creating a new file, set that to Liquid. And let's say, first of all, I want to retrieve a single record by GUID. So all that I need to do is say that I want the entities object. And here are some examples from my snippet file. So for example, I want to get a record by ID. If I want to, for example, use FetchXML and loop through the results, then all that I need to do is say fetch XML and loop, and there I go. So I've got a couple of snippets. I combined all in this one, for example. So let's say what I want to do is retrieve tracks for a given artist. So I just give that a name. So see, actually, once you've dealt with liquid a few times, it's actually quite easy to read. So this is saying that I'm doing a FetchXML query. Here's my unique name for that. So I need to paste in some FetchXML from advanced find. Nothing really complicated that I need to do myself. So write an advanced find in the same way I usually would in my model-driven app. Download the FetchXML, pop it in there. So essentially that is all the liquid that I would need for my query. Then I want to actually output something in the results, which the rest is for. So this is combining three of those liquid skills. First of all, fetch XML to query the records. Then I want to handle, well, what if there aren't any results? So I've got that included within an if statement rather than cause any mess on screen. So only if there are some results, which is what this is saying. So if that query, the size of that, so the number of results is more than 0, do this. So for is looping through all of those records. So for each of those tracks for this artist, output some fields. And these are just placeholders to show how I would do that. So I need the logical name from Dynamics or my model-driven app. And that just varies slightly depending on whether it's a text field, a lookup field, an option set. So that's what this commented section is all about. Another example might be if I want to return the number of results. Again, this is all available on the blog post that I'll share at the end, but let's say I want to retrieve a single record. So perhaps that's the most popular track or the most recent album release for a particular artist. Then I'm using FetchXML to retrieve a single record instead. So the output is very much the same. Liquid, I'm just using an open FetchXML, a closed FetchXML, and outputting results. So there's all kinds of things there that will all be available on the portal. Let's look at that note hyperlink. So this really was one of the most transformative things that I figured out through the portal and stumbled on it quite by accident, really. So it was for a much more boring portal project than the Spotify clone. This was all about sourcing properties. Wanted to make a brochure available for download. After quite a bit of Googling, found that there was a hyperlink in this particular format. So again, it was about pushing it, seeing how far I could take that. And what I learned was, in fact, that yes, you can output in that format, but from then, how can I use that? I wondered if I can use that for a download link. Could I use that to set the source of an image? Yes, I could. Cool. So if I can set the source of an image, could I maybe set the audio track for the audio player? Turns out that good. So essentially that was key to unlocking any multimedia capabilities on the Spotify portal. So there, within not so many lines, we've seen FetchXML, if statements, for loops, and notes. And in all honesty, there is nothing you'll see on the Spotify clone that uses anything but those skills. So I'm using that to set the background image. I'm using that to populate the audio player. I'm using that to populate the dashboard. And I'm using that on the profile page to show the profile photo. So 6 snippets, all of about 30 lines of code in total to build a Spotify clone. So it's just about using all of that creatively. Okay, so let's have a quick run through our 6 liquid skills. So in at number 1 is the note URL. This is what we use to output multimedia or to provide download links. So the format you see on screen, _entity/annotation, annotation being the logical name for the note entity, and then a GUID. So in this example, I'm getting that GUID for the note from my FetchXML. So here's an example of how that looks in the source code for my Songify portal. So in this example, it's being used to provide the cover artwork for Live Forever by Oasis. The source of the image is my portal URL and then this specific entity URL. Next is the entities object. This allows us to swap a GUID for an entire record. So if you're familiar with the URL format in portals, that tends to point to a specific template and then function mark ID equals and a specific GUID. So what does this line of code mean? Assign means create a variable, set a variable to this particular value. So I'm creating a variable called artist, and in it I'm retrieving and storing a particular artist record. So I have the keyword of entities and then in square brackets the logical name for that entity, and then I need to pass a GUID in this second set of square brackets. So request.params.id is a way of saying get the ID parameter from the URL. So if you're familiar with URLs in the portal, that tends to be your portal URL / the particular template / ID equals and a GUID. So what we're saying here with request.params.id is get the GUID from that ID parameter in the URL. Okay, so we've retrieved a record with that single line of code. How do we do anything with that? How do we use it in if statements? How do we output it on screen, for example? Well, this will differ depending on the type of field. So for things like dates, single line of text, numbers, it's a simple matter of the name of our variable, in this case artist, dot, and then the field name, the logical name for that field in Dataverse. For other more complex field types, like status reasons, option sets, and lookup fields, there's just a little bit more to it. So we need to specify in the case of status reasons and option sets, whether it's a numeric value or the label we wish to output. Generally, if we're using this in an if statement, we would use a value because that's unlikely to change over time, whereas for customer-facing aspects, so things we want to output as part of our template, as part of the visuals, we would use the label. Likewise, when it comes to lookup fields, so the example we show on screen there is the created by field, we need to determine whether it's the GUID we want to output or the name of that record. So again, most likely if you're using this in an if statement or using it to drive some other logic in your template, you would use the ID, the GUID. Whereas for customer-facing aspects, we would use the name. So for example, with the artist, it would make more sense to show the user that the artist for this particular track is Oasis as opposed to whatever their GUID is. Next, get into the real powerhouses of Liquid, FetchXML. We'll most commonly use this to retrieve multiple records. So maybe here are a list of all my likes, here are a list of all the artists. Here are all my playlists that I've created. Here are all the tracks that belong to that playlist. Here are all the artist's album. So all of that just goes between these two tags, an opening FetchXML tag and an end FetchXML tag. We give the query a name, the reason being that much like when we set that variable, we need a way to access those records. So this retrieves them for us but doesn't actually do any output. We'll see that in a separate slide. But in terms of how we actually generate that FetchXML, it's as simple as flexing your advanced find skills. So I think we all use that day to day within Dynamics in our model-driven apps. So we build our advanced find, then click download FetchXML and paste that within our FetchXML tags. So all the queries that you see on the portal, essentially on the Songify portal, are done with FetchXML. The next Liquid skill is very closely related. So we've done a FetchXML query. How do we actually access those results? How do we output anything on screen? So the for allows us to loop through each of those records and do something with them. So in this example, it's taking the tracks query, and for every result that's found, it's outputting the name of the track, saying which artist that track is by, and then is outputting the note image, the cover artwork for that particular track. Next, here's a slightly more novel way to use FetchXML, and this is to retrieve a single record. So you might be wondering, why would we use FetchXML to query a single record when we've got the entities object? Well, the difference is with the entities object, we have to know the GUID. We either have to have queried for it first, or we need to have it provided in the URL so that we can use that for the query. Whereas with using FetchXML to retrieve a single record, we've got much more flexibility. So essentially anything that we do in Advanced Find, we'll just take it one step further and we'll apply a particular sort order. So for example, of all the tracks, I want to see them in descending order by when they were created, telling me which is the most recent track. So sort order is one very important aspect, and the other, as you can see highlighted there, is I've had to specify in the first line of that FetchXML how many records I want returned. So I want the top one. Okay, but just remember, top doesn't particularly mean anything, it just means the first result. So you have to specify with the sort order, what do you mean by top? Do you mean the most recent, the most popular, the highest value, the lowest cost? So remember, the sort order is vital. And then our final skill of all our liquid skills is if. This allows us to do conditional work within the portal, and I've used it for some graceful degradation in the Songify portal. So planning for the inevitable data gaps, these things happen. So what if, for example, a track has got no artwork, or the audio for a particular track hasn't been uploaded, or the track name is thousands of characters long and won't actually fit in our template? Or what if we've got the wrong MIME type for the file attachment? What if we've accidentally uploaded an image as the audio track, or an audio file as the image? Also, a useful property to check against is size. Size will allow us to see how long is the text field, or whether a FetchXML query actually returned any results. Maybe we'd want to see if the length of the array that holds our results is greater than 0 before we actually output anything. So here's the makeup of an if statement within Liquid. The example on the left is checking whether the ID parameter in the URL is greater than 0. So we've seen request.params.id, but now we're taking the size, the actual length of that piece of text, that string. Is it greater than 0? If so, what do we do if true? The example on the right just shows that we can extend this further. So as well as our primary criteria for the if, we can have as many branches as we like using else if. Do please note it is ELSIF, that's not a typo, so it's not else if as in two words, it's else if condensed into one. So we can have as many branches as we wish, each with separate criteria, and then we can also provide a default action, else. So if none of the other criteria have been met, what do we do? I go through quite a lot of examples in the if deep dive on my blog, so feel free to scan that QR code, go check it out in detail. Here's an example of that graceful degradation in place on the Songify portal. So in the screenshot on the left, everything looks a mess. Where the tracks haven't had artwork uploaded, they haven't got any cover art in the note attachment, we get the horrible looking broken image tag. And another issue is that the alt text is so long that it's spilling over multiple lines. It's going over other rows within the table, making a real mess. So with just a little bit of extra work, in the example on the right, we've got a fallback position. So if artwork has been uploaded for that particular track, show the artwork. But if not, show a fallback image. Simple matter of an if statement, but makes for a much better user experience and a much cleaner user interface. And finally, let's bring together all our Liquid skills. So first of all, I've got a FetchXML query to return a list of tracks. I don't want to make a mess on the page trying to output something if that is empty. So I'm checking first of all, are there any results? Is a list of tracks longer than 0? And then I'm using for, our trusted looping action, to go through each of those results. And for each, in this example, it's outputting the name of the track, the artist, and then a thumbnail of the cover art, which we see there in the image tag. So lots of power all within very few lines of code. We can achieve a lot with very little using Liquid. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. If you'd like to discuss this further, if you'd like to connect with me, you can do so on Twitter. I'm at CRMBizCoach. If you'd like to connect on LinkedIn, I'm at Francesco Musso Dynamics 365. Probably much easier to scan the QR code than type all that out. And then finally, I've gone into quite a bit of detail in blog posts for all of the topics covered in today's talk. And you can find that at francomusso.com/Scottish-Summit-2021. So thank you again for attending. Thanks for sticking with me this far. I hope you found that really helpful and you've all taken away something new. If you'd like to rewatch that session or you'd like to share it with anybody else, that will be uploaded to YouTube after 14 days. Feel free to spread the love on social and just use the hashtag Scottish Summit 2021 as you see there on the left hand side. Have an awesome day and I'll see you at the pub quiz. For me, personal or passion projects are all about exploring and pushing the boundaries beyond what we get the freedom to explore in our day job. I've distilled the Liquid learning from my entire Spotify clone project down to just 6 key snippets. 6 skills that I believe will knock the 80-20 of learning Liquid. They open the door to endless new portal possibilities, and I'm excited to be the person that unlocks this skill and opens up these possibilities for you. Not a coder? No problem, nor am I. All these Liquid skills combined add up to only around 30 lines of code in total. And one? Well, that's just a URL, but a very powerful one, as we'll see. Welcome back. I hope you found the walkthrough useful and that it's given you a few ideas about new directions for your next portal project. The discovery that I found the most transformational, believe it or not, was just the URL to output notes. After all, it wouldn't be much of a Spotify clone without multimedia. This simple URL format unlocked all the multimedia capabilities, the audio player, the cover art, the gallery pages, everything. But here's a little history on how that came to be. That was born from a completely unrelated requirement on a separate portal project. I had the simple need on a property or real estate website to provide a record-specific download link to a PDF brochure that's automatically generated for each property. I figured that out with the help of some Googling and figured that, well, if that URL can link to a PDF, surely it could be used to link to an image. And then rather than link to an image, could I use it to set the source of an image? Turns out the answer was yes. Then if I can set the source of an image this way, you've probably guessed where this is going, could I use it to stream tracks in an audio player? Which brings me to my next point. My approach to squeezing every bit of usefulness out of every bit of code that I find, I don't just treat it as a one-off and conclude that it only applies to that one situation. So here's my non-coder's process to maximising what we learn from the code that we Google. First, ask yourself how else can you leverage this skill? Try to see past this very specific application. What would a generic version of this code look like? What's the pattern here? What's it achieving for us? And with another entity, what would be the difference? Next, how might I use this in creative and novel ways? Or how can I use this from a troubleshooting perspective? Perhaps I've identified gaps on other portal projects that I've failed to fix until now. Could this piece of code be the answer? Okay, next, let's go through our 6 Liquid snippets. So a very valid question, why would you create your own web templates? One of my guilty pleasures during lockdown has been Interior Design Challenge, a show on BBC. Imagine you're tasked with remodelling an office building for the best possible work experience, but you're restricted to painting it and decorating the existing walls, constrained by the existing layout. Think how much more powerful could that transformation be if you had control of where the doors and walls were, if you could change the ceiling height, had total control of the structure and the layout. That's essentially what you gain if you take the leap into creating your own web templates. We'll create our web templates using the Liquid templating language. Don't let the word language put you off. We can do a heck of a lot with very little code. My approach might sound very familiar. Google, find a piece of code, copy and paste it, adapt it to my needs, and job done. But then I like to spend more time, pick it apart, see why it was done that way. How can I reuse that snippet? How can I push it further? What else can this bring to my toolset and capabilities? Now I have an expanding library of snippets from many projects, and I'm going to take you through my most loved and my most transformational, powerful snippets. In fact, the whole Spotify clone was built with no than 6 snippets.